In my mind, most video game franchises can be classified in one of two ways. There are ones I would describe as iterative, you already know what I'm talking about, and that's when not much changes from one entry to the next apart from production value and maybe some quality of life improvements. Then on the other side, we've got what I dub progressive franchises, the type that aren't content with just updating their formula, but rather overhauling it or everything around it nearly every release. If you're at all familiar with the racing genre, then you already know that this video is about Need for Speed, which unmistakably falls within the latter. And much like another franchise I'm quite fond of, that quality is exactly what makes nearly each entry as polarizing and widely discussed as they are. Despite its supercar-centric roots, most would agree that Need for Speed's identity revolves around street racing, car tuning, and urban cop chases, myself included. But as you can tell by the title and thumbnail, today I want to talk about the game that fully explored a form of racing that the franchise had only vaguely flirted with in the past, and why it stands on its own merits even when faced with titans in the same field. Let's just jump straight into the core of any racing game, that being the handling model, and this is one of Shift's most contested aspects. While I understand the argument that it's maybe loose or unwieldy, I think the driving is what gives this game an edge, an identity, when compared to its contemporaries. There's obviously nothing wrong with how Forza or GT handle, but their far more grounded driving leaves the door open for a more visceral and chaotic experience. You actively need to tame the horses under your hood in Shift, with cars exhibiting both under and oversteer far more often than you might expect. And that's exactly what keeps you alert and awake throughout every event. And I mean that literally. I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but with certain racing games where the driving is considerably more predictable, I find myself zoning out at times and legitimately shutting my eyes, even if I'm not that tired. But even at 2 AM, that never happens with Shift, and I believe that's entirely down to just how on top of things you really need to be in order to even get a podium finish on anything above the easy AI setting. Speaking of AI, the racing genre is one of the few where I actually prefer playing on higher difficulty settings, as it makes for more exciting races. But here, I really had to work my way up slowly till I could keep up with even the medium setting. Hell, thanks to the lack of rewinds, one wrong move on easy can still be the end of your race. I don't necessarily have anything against rewinds, they've become a mainstay for a reason, but there's something to be said about the lack of safety net that gives weight to all of your on-track decisions. While we're still on the track, let's talk about the way Need for Speed Shift presents the main event. This is one aspect in which I've never heard this game criticized, and for good reason. Slightly Mad Studios were able to turn adrenaline into graphical output using camera shake, HUD shake, Gaussian blur, and even real-time color correction in the event of a crash, resulting in something I can only describe as an FPR. First-person racer. That term I just made up applies in two ways. The first being that the aforementioned visual effects make for a sense of character presence akin to that of a typical modern shooter, but also in the sense that this game is probably the only racing game I can only play effectively using the cockpit camera. I haven't recorded most of the footage in first person just to showcase the detailed interiors, but also because this was clearly the prioritized camera angle during development. I guess if I had to fault the presentation in any way, it would seriously have to be the chase cam, since there's just something about the way it tracks your car that makes cornering far more cumbersome than it really needs to be. And again, this is coming from someone who pretty much exclusively prefers exterior camera angles for these sorts of games. Although, I would still recommend you switch to the chase cam for at least a few seconds every race to admire the impressive damage model, which at that time was only rivaled by Grid. But as you would expect from something leaning slightly more towards simulation, its effects on your performance have considerably more nuance. Shift also contains an extra bit of visual detail that few other racing games bother with, and that's a unique speedometer and tach for nearly every car. And speaking of the HUD, you can cycle between different levels of on-screen information on the fly, which if I recall is pretty common on console, but I haven't really found many games that let you do this on PC, at least without going into a menu. Finally, keeping with Need for Speed tradition, the car sounds are incredible, and not just in the sense that everything sounds like a hypercar. High-end cars obviously have extremely loud and distorted exhaust notes, sometimes to the point of exaggeration, but lower-end cars will sound more contained, you know, more commute-friendly. Also on the topic of sound, I really like the little bit of chatter you get from your crew chief before every race. Not just because it adds that extra bit of polish, but there's something oddly wholesome about the fact that he'll pretty much always tell you to have fun.
Have fun, be careful.
To contrast the hectic nature of the on-track action, Need for Speed Shift opts for a set of sleek and semi-minimalistic menus that utilize literally every late 2000s graphic design cliche in the best way possible. Unlike almost every other entry in the series, including its own sequel, the accompanying music for these menus isn't just a random set of songs off the OST or remixes of said songs or hip-hop and lo-fi tracks dedicated to this part of the game, but instead, you're greeted with an ambient score made of a mix of tire screeches, engine roars, radio chatter, and the occasional reverb-soaked guitar part, all composed by that one guy you might know for doing the recent Doom soundtracks. Yeah, talk about versatility. While we're here, I recommend you take a look at the tuning menu for your current car, not just to demonstrate the nifty quick tuning option for those that get overwhelmed when faced with detailed car setting screens, but also to turn down the tire pressure and speed up the steering lock. Trust me, while I will always defend the default handling, I would still recommend you do a bit of tweaking because it can greatly smoothen the learning curve. It's become standard for pretty much every racing game, regardless of it being arcade, simcade, or full-on simulation, to include some sort of career mode that you work your way through, buying and upgrading new cars as you go, you know, the blueprint laid out by Gran Turismo. Need for Speed Shift's approach to this is probably my favorite meta design choice that draws inspiration from the most unexpected places. This may sound a bit crazy, but from my own experience, I strongly feel that this game has taken inspiration for its progression system from Super Mario 64. Think about it. You collect stars through completing races and secondary objectives during them. All stars are equal in value, which means you have a ton of freedom when picking which events to do, just like in Mario 64, how you can essentially ignore certain levels assuming you've got enough stars from others. And Shift, if you don't feel like doing the more mundane event types like time trials, well, you don't have to. Obviously, this isn't the only racing game out there to have a similar level of player agency, but I feel as if it strikes a great balance between linearity and freedom of choice. I find that some racing games, even ones I like, will either go too far in either of one direction. They might overwhelm the player with stuff to do, or provide no room for alternate routing at all. But here, I feel like the game respected my preference for certain event types over others, while still giving me a clear path to the next step in my racing career, due in no small part to the aforementioned menu design. Shift also doesn't lose touch with its arcade roots via a pseudo-rival system. Essentially, for a select series of races, you'll be racing against your usual pack of opponents, but one of their names will be highlighted in red. This is actually significant since the AI for that racer will be noticeably more aggressive and will usually be the one right behind you. To seal the deal, once you've completed every traditional event in a set category/series, you'll have to do a head-to-head race with that exact AI driver. The game even acknowledges them as an in-universe character via your crew chief.
Okay, I know all is good. He's a very technical driver, so this is not...
Another common problem that a lot of racing games, especially newer ones, face is car lists that deliver in quantity, but often end up not actually amounting to much since only a few of these cars are either the player's favorite or are at all optimal for competition. While Shift might not have the largest car list even for its time, a select few event types allow this limited selection to, at least for me, stand above the competition. What I'm referring to here are the manufacturer-specific events like Car Battle, Manufacturer Competition, Manufacturer Restricted Competition, and Invitational events. Aside from the MRCs, all other event types provide you with a car or a choice between two to compete in, with the invitationals often letting you drive something far above your current tier. MRCs differ in that you have to provide your own car, but that's still fine since they're late game events and the game is not at all stingy with its payouts. And on the topic of money, there's no shortage of ways to spend it. So you know how in Gran Turismo, you've got some race modified cars that can only be unlocked under specific conditions? Well, in Shift, you can take a compatible car, drop a bunch of cash in it, and have your own purpose-built race car. This isn't just a great way to allow lower-end vehicles to put up a fight late game, another staple of the franchise, but much like the MRCs, there exist works-restricted competitions, as well as supercars versus works events that require you to engage with the system at least a few times. By forcing the player to use specific cars that they may not own for these events, the game allows them to experience more of what the car list has to offer and in turn allows it to feel much more substantial since you'll actually be driving all of those promised cars as opposed to just knowing they're there, but not even bothering to drive them. That's all I've got as far as my reasons for holding Need for Speed Shift in as high regard as I do. I know a video like this might seem redundant, since the game did receive pretty good reviews when it came out, but from my observations of the fandom and general racing community, this game is seen as a case of good game on its own, but bad game for the franchise. And I'm gonna be honest, I've never subscribed to that way of looking at a game. I understand that it's all down to context, that people might be afraid that a certain entry would mark a turning point in the franchise from which there's no going back. And while it might be easy to just use hindsight in this case, since apart from a sequel, NFS has completely wiped any semblance of Shift off the face of its identity, I believe that even when the game released, any potential fear of permanent change would have been unwarranted. Case in point, this game released the exact same year and only around the month prior to Need for Speed Nitro, which is on the other end of the racing spectrum, to the point where it's basically Mario Kart with licensed cars and music. It's clear that after Undercover's critical reception, EA were simply trying to shake things up in an effort to give Black Box some time to regroup, since even the mindless suits know when it's time to ease off on a team that at that point had been working around the clock for 7 years straight. I mean, I guess in a way Shift did mark a change, since the next game, Criterion's Hot Pursuit, would see the return and more or less permanent stay of the brake-to-drift handling model that is, to some extent, still a part of Need for Speed's driving DNA. But I'm just playing devil's advocate at this point. Regardless, thanks for sticking around for another one of these kind of videos, and at this point, it's pretty much my main format. I'll see you in the next one.